Stephen sat in the dimly lit living room of his apartment, his fingers nervously tapping the table. The weight of the letter he held in his hand was unbearable. It had arrived earlier that day, a simple, inconspicuous envelope that contained the truth. The private investigator's findings about Sydney were clear, and now everything he thought he knew about his family was shattered. His heart raced as he reread the document. Sydney, his little girl, wasn't biologically his daughter. The words blurred as his mind raced, struggling to process the revelation. How could Jennifer have kept something so monumental from him? He felt an overwhelming mix of anger, betrayal, and confusion. His identity as a father had just been ripped away from him. The truth had been sitting there all along, but Stephen had never suspected. He'd always believed Sydney was his. They had shared countless moments, all the small joys of fatherhood, the first steps, the late-night talks, the laughter at the dinner table. Now, all those moments felt like lies. The letter in his hand was from the investigator he had hired in secret. He had suspected for some time that something wasn't right, but the truth hit him harder than he could have imagined. Sydney's biological father was someone else, someone he didn't know. His stomach twisted at the thought. The girl he loved, the daughter he had raised as his own, was not his. Stephen stood up abruptly, the room spinning around him. His mind tried to reconcile this new reality. Was Sydney still his daughter in every other sense? Could he continue to be the father he had always been to her? He thought of the smiles, the hugs, the love they had shared. That couldn't be erased. But the truth was undeniable. The anger began to boil inside him. Jennifer, his wife, now his ex-wife. How could she have kept this from him? Why hadn't she told him the truth earlier? All the years they spent together, was it all based on a lie? A knock at the door broke his thoughts. He turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. He knew it was her. He hadn't expected this to be the day when everything came crashing down. But now, as Jennifer stood on the other side of the door, he knew it was time to confront her. His hands shook as he opened it. The letter still clutched tightly in his grip. Jennifer's eyes softened as she saw him. "Stephen, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady, almost too steady. He didn't say anything. He held out the letter. Her face paled as she took it, her fingers trembling as she read the investigator's findings. A silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. For a moment neither of them spoke. Stephen's chest tightened. He couldn't wait any more. The questions had to be answered. "Why, Jennifer?" he asked, his voice low but shaking with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jennifer's eyes avoided his, her gaze flickering nervously. She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again. Her face was a mask, but he could see the guilt in her eyes. After what felt like an eternity, she sighed and spoke softly. "I never wanted to hurt you, Stephen. I thought it would be easier if you didn't know." Easier? Easier for whom? Stephen's mind screamed, but his body was frozen, his world had just crumbled. His heart, once filled with the joy of fatherhood, now felt like an empty vessel. He had been living a lie, and that lie had just been exposed. "Sydney's my daughter," he muttered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I don't care about the blood, but I need to know the truth. Why didn't you tell me?" Jennifer stepped back, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to respond, but words failed her. Stephen felt a lump form in his throat. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. The room, once filled with the noise of life and love, now felt cold and distant. He was lost, adrift in a sea of lies and unanswered questions. His mind kept coming back to one question. Who was Sydney's real father? The silence between Stephen and Jennifer was deafening. He had just learned that his entire life was built on a lie, and Jennifer's avoidance of his questions only deepened the wound. He had to know more. He needed answers, not just for himself, but for Sydney. "I'm not leaving until you tell me everything," Stephen said, his voice hoarse. Jennifer flinched but didn't look at him directly. Her gaze was fixed somewhere beyond him, as though the weight of the truth was too heavy to confront. "You don't understand, Stephen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was never supposed to be like this." Before Stephen could respond, a sharp knock echoed from the door. Jennifer turned, her expression changing instantly. It was Shirley. Shirley Skinner, Jennifer's mother, had arrived, and her presence was like a storm cloud rolling in. The tension in the room thickened. Shirley's protective instincts for Jennifer were well known, but Stephen had always felt the suffocating weight of her overbearing presence. Now, more than ever, he felt the divide between him and the woman who had once been part of his family. "Is everything all right in here?" Shirley's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Mom, Jennifer began, but Shirley raised a hand, silencing her. Stephen's jaw tightened. He could already sense what was coming. Shirley's gaze shifted from Jennifer to Stephen, a coldness in her eyes that sent a shiver down his spine. "I think it's time for you to leave, Stephen," she said firmly. This isn't helping anything." Stephen's mind raced. He was prepared to fight for the truth, but facing Shirley, who was always so sure of herself, was a different kind of battle. "You don't get it," Stephen said, stepping closer to Shirley. "This is about my daughter. You're not going to push me away like this." His voice rose, the frustration spilling out. Shirley didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, meeting him eye to eye. "This isn't about what you want, Stephen," she said, her voice sharp. "This is about what's best for Sydney. And you're not it." The words hit Stephen like a physical blow. He felt his chest tighten, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't need you to tell me what's best for her," Stephen shot back. "I'm her father. I have every right to be in her life. You're just trying to protect your daughter's lies." Shirley's expression hardened. "You think this is easy for Jennifer? For any of us?" She turned her gaze to her daughter, who was standing by the doorway, tears brimming in her eyes. "You've hurt her enough, Stephen. It's time for you to go." The words stung, but they weren't what cut the deepest. The look in Jennifer's eyes, fear, guilt, and regret, was enough to break Stephen's resolve. He had always known that Jennifer and Shirley's bond was tight, but seeing it so clearly in the moment felt like a betrayal. "I'm not leaving until I know the truth," Stephen said, his voice steadier now, though the pain still lingered. Jennifer wiped her tears and finally spoke, her voice shaking. "I didn't want this to happen, Stephen. I didn't want you to find out like this." Stephen's heart sank as he watched Jennifer, the woman he had once shared everything with, now reduced to tears. There was no turning back, but at that moment, he realized he wasn't just fighting for Sydney anymore. He was fighting for the truth, for something that had been kept from him, and for a future that now seemed uncertain. "We'll talk," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely a breath. "But not here. Not now. You need to go." Stephen looked at her one last time, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. As he walked out the door, Shirley's icy gaze lingered, watching him leave with the quiet assurance of someone who believed she had already won. But Stephen's resolve was only beginning to harden. This was far from over. The drive back to Jennifer's house was the longest Stephen had ever experienced. Every turn, every stoplight felt like an eternity as his mind raced with the weight of what he had learned. Sydney wasn't his daughter. The image of her laughing, playing, calling him daddy now seemed so distant, so fragile. He had been a fool. How could he have been so blind? As he parked his car outside Jennifer's house, a surge of anger and hurt twisted in his chest. He had to know the truth. Everything. No more evasions, no more lies. Stephen knocked sharply on the door. His hand trembled, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure how the conversation would unfold. Jennifer had already shattered his trust, but he still needed to hear it from her. He needed to hear why she did what she did. Jennifer opened the door slowly, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She didn't say anything, just stepped aside, allowing him in. "You said we'd talk," Stephen said, his voice tight. "I'm not leaving until I get answers, all of them." Jennifer's eyes flickered with regret, but there was no turning back now. She closed the door softly behind him, her movements slow, as though she knew the gravity of what was about to unfold. "You've got a right to know, Stephen," she finally spoke, her voice raw. She walked to the kitchen and sat at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But the truth, it's complicated. Stephen didn't sit down. He stood, his fists clenched at his sides. "What's so complicated? Tell me. Tell me why you kept this from me. Why you let me raise a child that wasn't mine." Jennifer flinched at the words but didn't break eye contact. She sighed deeply, the weight of years of secrets pressing down on her. "I didn't plan for it to happen, Stephen. I didn't want it to happen, but it did. And when it did, I couldn't tell you. I was scared." "Scared?" Stephen repeated, his voice rising. "You were scared? Scared of what? Of me? Or of losing everything?" Jennifer's gaze fell to the table. She shook her head slowly, as though struggling to find the right words. "I never meant to hurt you. I loved you. I thought I could fix things. Pretend like it didn't matter, that Sydney was yours. I thought I could give her a family. A stable life." She paused, her voice cracking. "But when I found out the truth, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to lose you, Stephen, and I didn't want to lose her." Stephen's heart twisted. There it was, the truth. Jennifer hadn't wanted to hurt him, but she had. She hadn't wanted to lose Sydney either, and in the process she'd lost everything. She'd kept the truth from him, all in the name of protecting a lie. "I couldn't tell you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't break your heart. And I couldn't break hers. Sydney, she didn't deserve to know, not like this. Not if it meant losing you." Stephen's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to shout, to let his anger out, but instead all he could do was stand there feeling empty. He had given everything for a family that wasn't his. He had fought for a child that wasn't his. "I was never part of this, was I?" Stephen's voice was thick with emotion. "I was just the man who showed up, the man who played the part of the father. All along I was just a placeholder." Jennifer's eyes welled up with tears. She looked at him, guilt and sorrow written all over her face. "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice trembling. "You were always her father, Stephen. You were the one who loved her, who cared for her, who gave her everything. She needed you. We both needed you." Stephen's mind reeled. The pain was too much to bear. He had been everything for Sydney, and yet he had been living in the shadow of a lie. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. This truth, this devastating, cruel truth, was unraveling him. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Jennifer?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jennifer stood up slowly, walking toward him. She reached out a hand, but he stepped back, unable to accept the comfort she offered. "I didn't know how to tell you. And then it was too late. We were already here. And I couldn't break you, not when you were the one person who could hold us together." Stephen's heart pounded. He had spent years building a life with her, building a family, and now everything he thought was real was nothing but a fragile illusion. "So what now?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What happens to me now? To Sydney?" Jennifer hesitated, her eyes searching his. "I don't know. I wish I could undo it all. But I can't. I'm sorry, Stephen. I never wanted to hurt you." For a moment there was nothing but silence. The weight of everything, of the past, of the lies, of the broken trust, hung heavy in the air. Stephen didn't know where to go from here, but one thing was certain. The road ahead was going to be far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Stephen stared at the empty space in front of him, the silence in his apartment oppressive. Jennifer's confession still echoed in his mind. Sydney wasn't his. He couldn't escape the truth. His thoughts spiraled as his mind tried to reconcile the love he had for a daughter who wasn't his and the betrayal he felt from the woman he had shared his life with. The air was thick with tension. Every corner of his apartment felt suffocating. He had always prided himself on being a man who could handle anything, who could face any challenge and overcome it. But this was different. The foundation of his life had crumbled, and there was nothing he could do to rebuild it. He stood up suddenly, pacing around the room, his hands running through his hair in frustration. How could Jennifer do this to him? How could she have kept something so important from him? He had given everything for Sydney. He had loved her as his own, and now it was all a lie. The questions swirled in his head like a tornado. Why hadn't he noticed the signs? Why had he been so blinded by love that he couldn't see what was in front of him? Sydney was the one person who had made him feel whole again after the heartbreak of his divorce, the one bright light in his life, and now that light had been extinguished. The sound of his phone buzzing interrupted his thoughts. He grabbed it, desperate for a distraction, and saw Jennifer's name flashing on the screen. His stomach churned. He didn't want to answer, but something in him urged him to pick up. "Stephen?" Jennifer's voice crackled through the line, her tone softer than he expected. "Can we talk?" He was silent for a long moment. Talk? After everything? He had just learned that his entire world was built on lies, and she wanted to talk? What more is there to say? Stephen's voice was cold, but his chest tightened with emotion. "You've already said everything I need to know. I didn't want to hurt you." Jennifer's voice trembled. "I know it was wrong. I didn't know how to fix it. But I need you to understand, Sydney, she's still our daughter. You're the only father she's ever known. That means something, Stephen." He clenched his jaw, the words cutting deeper than he expected. "It doesn't change anything. The truth is out now, Jennifer, and I don't know if I can keep pretending." There was a pause on the other end of the line. He could hear Jennifer's breath catch, as if she was struggling to hold back tears. He wanted to feel sympathy, wanted to comfort her, but the hurt was too raw. It was as if he had been betrayed by everyone, by Jennifer, by Sydney, by the life he had built. "I don't know what to do anymore," Jennifer continued, her voice breaking. "Please, Stephen, don't walk away from us. I know this is hard, but you've been a father to her. Please don't turn your back on her now." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He closed his eyes, the weight of it all crashing down on him. Could he really just walk away from Sydney, the girl he had raised, the girl he had loved as his own? I don't know if I can be her father anymore, Stephen said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not after everything. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment Stephen wished the world would just stop spinning. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know who he was anymore. The love he had for Sydney was still there, but it was tangled with the overwhelming sense of betrayal, and he didn't know how to untangle it. "I'm sorry," Jennifer whispered, barely audible. "I don't know what to say. I just don't want to lose you." The guilt in her voice was undeniable, and it gnawed at Stephen. He couldn't deny that a part of him still cared for her, still wanted to believe in the life they had shared. But the other part, the part that felt betrayed, the part that felt like a fool, was too loud to ignore. "I can't do this right now," Stephen said, his voice tight. "I need space. I need to think." There was a long pause, and then Jennifer spoke, her voice steady now, as if she had resigned herself to the reality. "Okay, I understand. Just please think about what's best for Sydney." "I'll think about it," Stephen muttered, but even as he said the words, he wasn't sure what he was thinking about anymore. His whole world had been shattered in a single moment, and now all he could do was try to make sense of the wreckage. He ended the call without another word, dropping the phone onto the couch. The room felt colder now, as if the very walls were closing in on him. He walked over to the window and stared out, but he didn't see anything. All he saw was the empty space where his certainty used to be. How could he go on? How could he face Sydney, knowing what he now knew? He didn't have the answers, and he didn't know where to begin. The knock on the door was sharp, loud, almost commanding. Stephen hesitated for a second before he opened it. He had been pacing in his apartment for hours, stewing in anger and confusion. But he knew this moment was inevitable. The confrontation had to happen. It wasn't just about Sydney anymore. It was about the lie that had fractured everything. The life they had built. The trust he had given so freely. Jennifer stood there, her face a mixture of regret and desperation. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something else too, something he couldn't quite place. "You wanted to talk?" Stephen's voice was colder than he intended. He didn't even know if he wanted to talk. What was left to say? The truth had already come crashing down around them. "Stephen," she said softly, her voice trembling as she stepped inside, "I need you to understand what happened between us, between me and Sydney. It wasn't just a lie. It was a mistake I never wanted to make." He shook his head, frustration rising like a tidal wave. "A mistake? Jennifer, you didn't make a mistake. You kept a secret from me, a secret that changed everything, and now I'm left to pick up the pieces. My entire life was based on a lie." Her face crumpled, and for a brief moment, Stephen saw the vulnerability beneath the defensive walls she had built. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know what would happen if I did. I didn't want to lose you, Stephen." The words hit him harder than he expected. The pain of betrayal was still fresh, but hearing her speak those words, hearing her admit that she was afraid to lose him, cut through the anger. It made everything feel even more complicated. "Why didn't you trust me?" His voice cracked, the hurt seeping through despite his best efforts. "Why didn't you come to me when you found out? I would have done anything. We could have dealt with it together. But instead you let me live in a lie." Jennifer reached out to him, her hand trembling as she stepped closer. "I was scared," she whispered. "I was scared that if you knew, you wouldn't love me anymore. And I couldn't bear that, Stephen. I couldn't lose you, not like that." The confession left him breathless, but it didn't erase the bitterness he felt. "I never cared about biology, Jennifer. I cared about being there for Sydney, for you. I loved her. I loved both of you. But you took that away from me." Jennifer closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I never meant to hurt you. You have to believe that." The words echoed in his mind, but they didn't erase the sting of betrayal. He had been living with a shattered image of what he thought was his family. And now that the truth was out, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. As the silence stretched between them, something shifted in Stephen. He wasn't sure what he expected from this conversation, but it certainly wasn't resolution. There was no coming back from this, not completely. The damage was done. But then, there was the other part of him, the part that still cared for Jennifer, the part that still wanted to protect Sydney. He was stuck between two worlds, one that held on to the past, and one that was pulling him toward an uncertain future. "I can't just walk away from her," Stephen said, his voice steady but tinged with pain. "Sydney, she's not just your daughter, she's mine too, even if the blood doesn't match. I've been her father since the day she was born. I've loved her like my own. and I don't know how to let that go." Jennifer nodded, tears spilling down her face. "I don't want you to walk away. I never wanted that. I didn't know how to make it right." Stephen stepped back, the weight of the conversation sinking in. "You can't just ask me to forget. I need time to process this. I need space to figure out what happens next." The words hung in the air between them. Jennifer reached out once more, but Stephen held up his hand, signaling that he needed space. He couldn't go back. Not yet. Not without understanding what had been broken, and whether there was any way to fix it. "I'll be here when you're ready," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible. Stephen walked toward the door, his hand resting on the handle. As he opened it, he took one last look at Jennifer. For a moment, he saw the woman he had loved, the mother of his child, but that image quickly faded, replaced by the reality of what had happened. The door closed behind him with a finality that felt heavier than anything he had ever experienced. The sound of the doorbell was a sharp intrusion on the silence that had settled over the house. Stephen's heart raced as he slowly made his way to the door, not knowing who could be standing on the other side. The weight of his own thoughts had consumed him ever since that conversation with Jennifer. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, or even how to begin processing everything. He opened the door to find Jennifer standing there, her face pale, eyes wide with something he couldn't quite read. "Stephen," she said breathlessly, as if the words had been caught in her throat, "you need to come with me, now." The urgency in her voice struck him immediately. He didn't hesitate. Without saying a word, he followed her down the stairs and into the car. The air was thick with unspoken tension, both of them lost in their own thoughts, as Jennifer drove in silence. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally Jennifer spoke. "I don't know what to say, but it's about Sydney." Stephen's chest tightened at the mention of her name. His mind raced, wondering if something had happened to her. "What's going on? Is she okay?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. "She's—" Jennifer faltered, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "She's gone, Stephen?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Gone? His mind struggled to process the statement, but all he could hear was the ringing in his ears. "What do you mean, gone?" He could barely breathe. Jennifer pulled the car into the parking lot of a local park. She put the car in park and turned toward him, her face filled with horror. "Sydney, she's disappeared. I don't know how, I don't know why, but she's gone." His heart stopped. Panic surged through him, the world tilting beneath his feet. "Where is she? Tell me where she is!" Stephen's voice cracked as he reached for the door handle, desperate to get out of the car. "She's missing, Stephen! I don't know where she went! She was just there, and now she's gone!" Jennifer's hands were trembling as she wiped away the tears that had begun to fall. The sight of her, usually so composed, now completely unraveling, hit Stephen harder than he expected. His mind was still reeling from the events of the past days, and now this was something far worse than he could have imagined. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Stephen shouted, anger flaring. He couldn't contain the frustration building within him, the anxiety and helplessness pouring out. "I didn't know how," Jennifer whispered, her voice broken. "I thought she was just hiding. I thought she would come back, but it's been hours and she hasn't. She broke off, gasping for air, unable to continue. Stephen ran his hands through his hair, pacing in the parking lot. His mind was a blur. Sydney was gone. The girl who had been his daughter, his entire reason for fighting, was missing. He couldn't believe it. How could she just vanish like that? "I'm calling the police," he said suddenly, his voice steadying, but only just. "We have to find her. We have to do something." Jennifer nodded wordlessly, her face drained of color. She wasn't the only one who felt helpless. They both were. They had no idea where Sydney could be, or why she had disappeared. But one thing was certain. Whatever had happened, it wasn't something they could fix alone. Stephen grabbed his phone, dialing the number for the police. His hands were shaking, his breath uneven. But he had to do this. For Sydney. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. The officers spoke with Jennifer, trying to piece together what had happened. But all they had were the same fragments of information. Sydney had simply vanished. "Don't worry," one of the officers said, trying to reassure them. "We'll find her. We just need you to stay calm and answer a few questions. The more information we have, the faster we can act." Stephen nodded, his mind still racing. He had to stay focused. He had to find Sydney. But as the hours stretched on, the weight of the situation began to sink in. Sydney was out there somewhere, alone, and they had no idea where. His thoughts returned to the conversation with Jennifer. how she had looked at him with that same helpless expression as she told him their daughter was gone. The reality of the situation was almost too much to bear. Sydney was the one thing in his life that had always felt certain, always felt real. And now, she was gone. The police arrived shortly after the call, their flashing lights cutting through the stillness of the night. Stephen stood at the edge of the yard, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, his eyes scanning every corner of the yard, as though Sydney might appear from behind the trees. It felt like a nightmare, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing her forever. Jennifer had gone inside to speak with the officers, but Stephen couldn't sit still. His mind raced with every possibility. Was she hiding somewhere? Had she run away? Or was there something worse at play? He turned when one of the officers approached. "Mr. Watkins," the officer called, his tone calm but serious. "We need to ask you some questions about Sydney. The more we know, the faster we can get started." "Of course," Stephen replied, his voice strained. "I'll tell you everything. Please, just find her." The officer led him to a separate area near the car, away from the house. The night air felt colder now, the weight of the situation growing heavier by the minute. "Can you tell us about Sydney's routine?" the officer began. "Anything unusual in the days leading up to her disappearance?" Stephen swallowed hard. He had been so wrapped up in his own turmoil that he hadn't even noticed if Sydney had seemed different. She was fine. Nothing out of the ordinary. She's a bright girl. Kind of quiet sometimes, but I thought it was just a phase. We were all distracted. He hesitated, glancing down at his shoes. But recently there were fights between me and Jennifer. I think that might have affected her, but she didn't show it. She never said anything to me directly. The officer took notes, nodding. "Was there anyone she's been in contact with that you didn't know about? Friends? Family?" "No," Stephen answered quickly. "She's had her friends, but I've always kept track. She's never done anything like this before." "Did she ever express any feelings of wanting to leave, of being unhappy?" the officer asked. Stephen's breath caught in his throat. He thought back to the days before Sydney disappeared. The tension between him and Jennifer, the conversations they'd had. Had Sydney heard things she shouldn't have? Had the unraveling of their family caused her more distress than he realized? I don't know," he stammered. "She never mentioned anything, but I don't know what was going on in her head." The officer's expression softened for a moment. "We'll look into her social media, contacts, and anything that might point us in the right direction. We're going to pull in the resources, Mr. Watkins. We'll do everything we can." Stephen nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't ease. Every second that passed, every minute that Sydney was still missing, felt like an eternity. He wanted to be out there searching for her himself, not standing here answering questions that felt so futile. As the officer walked away, Stephen turned back toward the house. Jennifer was speaking with another officer now, her face pale, her eyes distant. She didn't look like the woman he had known, the woman who had once been full of life and love. Now she seemed as lost as he was. Stephen approached her slowly. "What's happening? What are they saying?" Jennifer wiped her eyes, her hands trembling as she lowered her head. They're taking statements from everyone. They're searching the house, the park. They'll call in a search team, but, Stephen, I don't know where she could be. I don't know what happened." Stephen's chest tightened, and he stepped closer, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. He could feel the tremble in her, the weight of her fear and guilt pressing down on her. He didn't know if it was too late to fix what had been broken between them. But right now, Sydney needed both of them. "I'll find her," Stephen said, his voice low but determined. "We will find her, I promise." Jennifer didn't answer. She just nodded, her face a mask of grief and uncertainty. Stephen could see the pain in her eyes, but also something else, a fear he had never seen before. It was as if she had already accepted that they might not find Sydney in time. As the officers continued their work, Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. Sydney's disappearance wasn't just a child running away. It was something deeper. He had no evidence, no leads, but the gnawing feeling that this was connected to the unraveling of everything he had thought was stable in his life refused to let him go. He turned and walked back to his car, his mind spinning with unanswered questions. Whatever had happened to Sydney, he knew one thing for certain. He would not stop until he had found her, whatever it took. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustling of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet. Stephen sat at the defense table, his hands clenched into fists, his heart racing. The walls seemed to close in on him as he watched Jennifer take her seat on the witness stand. His breath caught in his throat. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had built a family with, was about to testify against him. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Stephen's lawyer stood up, briefcase in hand, and walked toward the witness stand where Jennifer sat, her eyes downcast, her hands trembling in her lap. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. "Miss Watkins," Stephen's lawyer began, his voice steady but cutting through the tension. "You and Mr. Watkins were married for several years, correct?" Jennifer nodded, her eyes still not meeting Stephen's. "Can you tell the court why you kept the truth about Sydney's paternity from Mr. Watkins?" The question hung in the air, and for a long moment Jennifer didn't answer. Stephen could see the weight of the question on her. He knew what she was thinking, whether to tell the truth, to say it all out loud, or to continue protecting herself. Jennifer's voice cracked. "I didn't want to lose him. I thought that if he knew, he would leave. I didn't know how to tell him. I didn't want to break up our family." The words stung, but Stephen kept his face impassive. He didn't want to show any weakness. "Miss Watkins," the lawyer pressed, "how did you feel when you found out the truth about Sydney's paternity?" Jennifer's eyes flickered briefly to Stephen before looking away again. Her voice was low, but filled with emotion. "I felt guilty. I felt like I had betrayed him, betrayed everything we had. But Sydney, she needed her father. I didn't want her to lose that, so I kept the secret." "Did you consider telling Mr. Watkins the truth?" the lawyer asked, his tone sharp. "I considered it," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I thought it was better this way." Stephen's stomach turned. He had been living in a lie, believing in a family that wasn't his. Sydney wasn't his daughter. The woman he had loved, who had been his partner for so many years, had kept that truth from him. As Jennifer's testimony continued, Stephen felt as if the walls were closing in. The legal arguments about custody were secondary now. The truth, about Sydney, about Jennifer, about everything, was the real battle. Jennifer's testimony finally came to an end, and Stephen's lawyer called him to the stand. He stood slowly, his legs stiff, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to say, how to make the court understand the pain he had gone through. As he walked to the witness stand, he could feel Jennifer's eyes on him. He had thought he would be angry, but instead, all he felt was a deep sense of loss. He didn't know how to reconcile the man he had been with the reality of who he was now. "Mr. Watkins," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court why you've come here today, after everything that has happened?" Stephen's voice was steady, though his heart raced. "I came here to be heard. I came here because I need to understand what happened to my family. I loved Sydney like she was my own, and I still do. I don't care about the blood. She was my daughter. But now I don't know where I fit in." His words were raw, and for a moment the room fell silent. He looked at Jennifer sitting across from him, her eyes red. He saw the guilt there, but he also saw something else, a pain that mirrored his own. The prosecutor asked more questions, but Stephen barely heard them. His mind kept returning to Sydney. He was fighting for a piece of his life that had been stolen from him, but the pain of losing Sydney, of having her torn away from him, even if by her own choice, was unbearable. The cross-examination came, and Jennifer's lawyer pressed Stephen harder. "Mr. Watkins, do you believe you have the right to be Sydney's father, even though the blood test shows otherwise?" Stephen paused, the question hanging in the air like a weighted anchor. "I've been her father," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been the one who loved her, the one who raised her. Blood doesn't change that." The lawyer's voice was sharp. "But you aren't her biological father. How can you claim to be the man who deserves to raise her?" Stephen stood his ground. "Because being a father is more than just biology. It's about love, it's about sacrifice. And I've done both for Sydney. I am her father, no matter what the blood test says." The room fell into a tense silence. The judge leaned forward, his gaze heavy. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We will recess for the day. Mr. Watkins, we will consider everything you've said. We will reconvene tomorrow." As the gavel fell, Stephen felt like he had just been hit with a wave. The courtroom faded away, and all that remained was the thought of Sydney, of everything he had lost, and everything he was still fighting for. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the backyard where Sydney now stood. The wind played gently with her hair, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the weight of the past lifting, if only slightly. She was no longer in the middle of a storm. She had stepped into something new, something that wasn't defined by the pain or betrayal of the past. Ashley stood by the door watching Sydney. Her niece, now her daughter in every sense that mattered, was standing on the porch, looking out into the distance. There was a time when Sydney had been a child full of light, always laughing, always joyful. But the girl in front of her now was different. The innocence had been stolen, and in its place a hardened, wary young woman had emerged. Still, there was something in Sydney's posture today, a quiet hope perhaps, that told Ashley that maybe, just maybe, they could begin again. "I don't know if I can do this." Sydney's voice broke through Ashley's thoughts. The words were soft but heavy, as though they had been carried inside her for far too long. Ashley stepped outside, her footsteps quiet on the wooden porch. She reached out gently, touching Sydney's shoulder. "You don't have to do anything alone, Sid. You don't have to carry it by yourself anymore." Sydney glanced at Ashley, her eyes filled with unspoken words. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The silence between them was enough. Sydney had been through so much in such a short time, losing her father, learning that the man who raised her wasn't her biological father, and now everything she knew had been turned upside down. But Ashley wasn't going anywhere. She had promised to be there for Sydney, and no matter what happened, she would keep that promise. "I miss him," Sydney finally whispered, her voice breaking. The tears she had held back for so long began to spill, and she turned away, not wanting Ashley to see the pain. "I miss Stephen. I don't know how to make it stop." Ashley moved closer, wrapping her arms around Sydney as the girl sobbed. It was the first time since the chaos began that Sydney had allowed herself to grieve. She had been so strong, so resolute, but now she finally broke, letting out everything she had kept inside for months. "I know, baby," Ashley whispered, her voice filled with both sadness and love. "I know. He loved you so much." Sydney leaned into Ashley's embrace, feeling the weight of the loss. It wasn't just the loss of a father figure, it was the loss of an entire life she had known. And in this new life, she didn't know where she fit. All the pieces of her world had shattered, and now she was left picking up the fragments, trying to make sense of it all. But in that moment, as she stood there with Ashley, she realized something important. She wasn't alone anymore. She had someone who cared for her, someone who would help her rebuild, piece by piece. "I don't know where to go from here," Sydney said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "You don't have to know right now," Ashley replied. "One step at a time. That's all we can do." Sydney looked up at Ashley, her eyes red and swollen from crying, but there was a glimmer of something new there, a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe with time she could heal. Maybe with Ashley's help she could find a way to live again, to love again, even after everything that had happened. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows over the yard. Sydney felt a strange sense of peace as she stood there, watching the day fade away. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. She could take it one day at a time, and maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to move forward. "It's going to be okay, Sid," Ashley said gently. "We'll figure it out together." Sydney nodded, her heart heavy, but not as broken as it had been. She didn't have all the answers, and she knew there would be tough days ahead. But for now, standing on this porch with Ashley beside her, she felt like she had a chance to heal, a chance to start over. What do you think of Stephen's journey and the emotional twists in this story? From which region are you watching this video? If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our captivating stories. Be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.